There's a land just off the Atlantic, land of jungles, waterfalls, and sweet scenery, where poor people farm the lands and hunt the waters, and all live in peace and harmony. This is Guyana, beautiful Guyana. This is Guyana, beautiful Guyana. Diamond seekers go in the interior, pulling their creoles under the falls, singing sweet calypso as they heave on their way to dig up the diamond and the gold. Great kite-jaw tumbling to the river, how I love to see your foaming tide. I listen to the chirps of the cheerful kiskadee as they throw the yellow breast to the sky. Oh, Guyana, land where I was born. Oh, land.
Let us cooperate for Guyana. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and today we continue our examination of public policy, particularly foreign policy as it relates to domestic policy. And today's topic will be about the huge Venezuelan migration, particularly of the Warao people. What are we going to do about the Warao migration into Guyana? Every one of us, every mother's son should be concerned about the boatloads of Warao sailing into the country wild west, particularly in Region 1 and also in Region 2, Borima Waini and the Pomeroon Supernam regions. About 36,000 Venezuelan migrants are now in Guyana. Some live in hard-to-reach areas along the border, the 800-kilometer border we have with Venezuela. Of those 36,000, but 5,000 are from the Warao ethnic group. And there are some Warao in Guyana, but as you know, we have 9 indigenous ethnic groups. But the Warao, I'm told that Warao means boat people. These are people who live in riverine areas, maybe swampy areas. They're different from Guyanese Warao. They're different from Guyanese Akawai or Arekuna or Carib, Arawak. Guyanese Amerindians are integrated in society, whether they're coastal or rural or urban or from the savannas. They're all part of Guyana society, but the Warao who coming are different. It is difficult to imagine how they will be integrated in Guyanese society because They live by fishing, by hunting, by eating crabs or catching fish in those riverine areas. They're not savannah people. They're not part of a settled community, but they're coming here by the boatloads. And I think their arrival has been, I would say, not entirely expected, especially the numbers that are coming into the country. Um, we don't know exactly how many there are. As I said, we've been told by some sources there are about 36,000 Amerindians, mainly Amerindians from Venezuela living in the country. And they've settled mostly in the Burima Waini region, Region 1. When you consider that in that region, Burima Waini, the population of Guyanese-born people, um, including Americans and mixed people and Africans and East Indians, is only about 26,000. You have to wonder whether Guyanese nationals are being displaced by Venezuelan migrants in that important area, which of course is part of the territory claimed by Venezuela. So we may have a strategic dilemma there in that one of the regions claimed by Venezuela is actually populated largely by Venezuelans, people who don't have loyalty to the Guyana state. But that is something we must deal with, the government must deal with at the present time during this crisis. I call it a crisis. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees also reported that the migrants, by and large, and particularly the Warao, they beg. That is the major economic activity. They live by begging. They depend on handouts. They work at odd jobs. They don't come with skills which Guyanese employers are seeking. They eat one meal a day. Some people don't eat on a given day. And they don't have access to clean drinking water. They drink the river water, and sometimes if there's mining or if there's pollution, they could become sick as a result of the dirty water. Most disturbing, and some of you have seen the newspapers, you see Warao scavenging in garbage dumps. Now, the people in Northwest, in the Burima Waini, many of them are poor, but even they were shocked to see people, scavenging in garbage dumps looking for food to eat. They don't get any wages, any salaries. Many of them are living on the margins of the economy, of the market economy. And government has a burden to bear. The regional administration, the RDC, has a heavy burden to bear. They have to provide food because some of these migrants have been raiding farms, destroying farms, just pulling out food or fruit or roots to eat. They're so hungry, they're so desperate. So the government and the RDC are providing food, but how long can people survive on hampers and handouts? Um, some of them need shelters. Some of them, of course, have to get education. Many of them don't speak English. Um, some of them bring in diseases. As you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, the COVID pandemic. They bring communicable diseases. And it's difficult to communicate with them because, they don't speak English. I myself, when I, was in office a few years ago, I went into a community in Baramita and Whitewater, two communities really. And there were cases in which Guyanese Warao children were not going to school because they didn't speak English and couldn't understand the teachers, and the teachers couldn't speak Warao. So if that is a problem we had with our own Warao children years ago, you can imagine what is happening now. That our own children were not going to school, and now you have thousands of Warao children coming into the country, unable to communicate with the government officials, with medical personnel, and police, and so on. So there is something of a cultural shock. There is a cultural shock because many of the residents in Region 1 and Region 2 are uncomfortable with the unregulated inflow of thousands of Venezuelans. And these people are not registered. We don't know how many there are. We don't have a register of their, their personal data about citizenship, and this is creating a very, very serious problem. We have an almost 800-kilometer border with Venezuela, and for the longest while, maybe 8 years or so, since the death of President Hugo Chavez, uh, Venezuelan economy has been in difficulties. And in fact, Venezuela is responsible for the largest displacement of refugees in the history of South America ever. Over 6 million Venezuelans have fled their country, going into, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and Colombia, and Brazil, and some of them have been coming to Guyana. Well, in one way, they have preferred to go to Spanish-speaking countries like Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, but we have also had to deal with, the thousands who are coming across the border. It is not a secure border. Our border with Venezuela is not. It has never been secure, as you know. In 1966, the Venezuelans seized Coco, which is on the border. And it has always been a fragile frontier. While I was in office, I launched a special operation called Operation Armadillo, which was to fortify military bases along that border, places like Caican, Arau, Whitewater, Baramita, because the Venezuelans sometimes were coming in raiding indigenous communities. They were sometimes even soldiers would come into Guyana looking for food or medical attention because of the problems in Venezuela. And there were gangs, they call it sindicatos, who were raiding communities, raiding mining camps, committing murders. And it has been a very uncomfortable period over the last 6 or 8 years for Guyanese. There is an element of lawlessness, but Guyana does not have the security forces, it does not have the population, it does not have the administrative infrastructure to protect that border against banditry, against crime, against smuggling, and against people trafficking. So we are in a very difficult situation as we speak today. And over the last 6 years or so, the Venezuelan crisis, the humanitarian crisis, has not only led to the displacement in the rest of the continent, but this has been compounded in Guyana by the fact that in the 1980s, several Guyanese in Region 1 and Region 2 had actually gone to Venezuela and are now starting to come back because of the economic problems in Venezuela. So the Venezuelan migrants are compounded by persons of Guyanese descent. Every now and then you come across somebody called, Ricardo Biznat. He's got a Venezuelan first name, but he's the son or the child of a Guyanese, a person of Guyanese origin. So over the years, particularly, from the previous regime in the, 2020, 2011, all the way up to 2022, as we are in now, migrants have been pouring in, and some of them are women, and I think young women, and this is creating some social problems. Social integration is one of the biggest problems because they haven't been welded into Guyanese society, and they haven't been registered. That is one of the reasons why one of the first things I did in 2015 and going into office is to establish something called the Department of Citizenship. And that department has been responsible for managing Venezuelan migration ever since, of course, when the PPP got into office. They just dismantled the Department of Citizenship and put nothing in its place. So we are seeing an increase in Warao in from August 2021, that is last year. About 1,200 have come into official entry points in Region 1 and 2. And as I said before, about 36,000 of them are now in the country. And they outnumber Guyanese in Barima Waini and particularly Barima Waini. Not quite Pomeroon Supinam, but Barima Waini has been the target area. Many of them are living in very, very poor conditions, very poor conditions. We have international obligations. We cannot turn away refugees. And I deeply regret the shutting down of the Department of Citizenship, which was under Minister Vincent Felix. I think it's a stupid step that in the middle of a migration crisis, you set down the one department that is responsible for coordinating the management of thousands of refugees. This is not a trickle. This is a flood of refugees that we have to deal with. Guyana signed the what is called the New York Declaration for Refugees at the United Nations Conventions in 2016 during my administration. So we have a commitment. We have a commitment to enforce measures and implement mechanisms to protect people who are on the move. Under international law, we can't turn them back, like boat people you may see happening in some other countries. We are obliged to receive them. And we have also adhered to, other compacts or conventions on refugees and conventions which deal with the orderly management of refugees. And we have ratified 9 international instruments in the field of human rights. The Protocol Against Smuggling of Migrants by Land, Sea, and Air. This supplements the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And we have other conventions, like conventions dealing with the status of refugees and the protection of persons from enforced disappearance. This sometimes happens in other countries. You see people in boats being killed or drowning. But we are obliged to protect people who come to us, looking for refuge and for safety. So we cannot escape from international law. We cannot escape from our obligations. But at the same time, we on our own do not have the resources to deal with these thousands of Venezuelan refugees. And as I pointed out a minute ago, even for our own hinterland indigenous communities, we do not have the resources to train our policemen, our doctors, our nurses, our teachers to speak the languages of our indigenous people. And this becomes worse when you're dealing with thousands upon thousands of Venezuelans who are not accustomed to Guyanese way of life and, of course, have a completely different background. So the situation facing Guyana is a critical one. And I say this because every Guyanese has to be concerned. Because when you're talking about Venezuelan migration, you're talking about the greatest amount of people coming into this country in a short period of time since East Indian immigration stopped in 1917. We have never had such an inflow of migrants to Guyana for over 100 years. And what is taking place now will change the complexion of our country, will change the character of our country. There are areas in this country that we will soon not be able to recognize as Guyanese if we allow this migration to go unchecked. I'm not suggesting that we stop it, I'm suggesting that we manage it, that we control it. Now, East Indian migration stopped about 105 years ago, I think, in 1917 or thereabouts. more than 5 years, maybe 15 years ago, whatever. It slowed to a trickle and then it was cut off completely. So what we're seeing now is not being managed. It is ad hocery at its worst. You just see boatloads of people coming, but they're destitute. They come without skills. They come without food. All they come with what you see in that canoe. All they come with is what they see. And when that food is exhausted, it means that the government of Guyana has to bear the burden. When I was in office, I established what is called the National Multisectoral Coordinating Committee. And this committee, which was under the Department of Citizenship, collaborated with UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children Emergency Fund, with IOM, the International Organization for Migration, PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, PADF, which is the Pan American Development Fund, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So these international organizations played a key role in helping Guyana to understand and to manage the problem of migration. Particularly, PAHO played a role in helping to fight AIDS because these migrants bring diseases with them. So problems like AIDS have to be managed. You have other communicable diseases, you have malaria, you have tuberculosis. Condoms have to be distributed. Testing for HIV has to be done. Testing for COVID has to be done. But the Department of Citizenship, which we established under the coalition, was managing this quite well until, of course, in August 2020, it was just disbanded. So we had issues up to the time we were in office of public health. As you know, we were in the middle of a pandemic. We had issues of public security because crimes were being committed. And as I said, some of these migrants, if they're hungry, they raid private property. And of course, private farmers, will have to defend their property. Unfortunately, some women have appeared on the streets, providing favors for money. And we have to provide assets and services to what was then the Ministry of Social Protection. Civil Defense Commission was involved, but this can only provide, temporary handouts, hampers. It cannot provide long-term solutions to sustaining such a huge population. So we have to put back together an organization which includes public security, which includes public health, and which includes social protection. And UNICEF has played a very important role, and UN High Commission for Refugees, because they're starting to teach children to speak English. And they're working with other state agencies. As you know, some of the non-governmental organizations have also played a role. But although these are important interventions, they're not sufficient to deal with the problem we have in mind. My friends, we now need to look seriously at the question of Venezuelan migration. We are speaking about a continuous flow. What started as a trickle has now become a flood. We're speaking about a huge mass of people which outnumbers the citizens of one of our regions, a vulnerable region. And we must therefore place emphasis on a long-term solution, not just ad hocery, not just handouts and hampers, but we have to think of what will happen to migrants over the next 5 or 10 years. And in dealing with that crisis, we need to call attention to the work that 4 ministries can do. Now, I think the government was probably too embarrassed to reestablish the Department of Citizenship. Now that they know that dissolving that department was a stupid move. And I would propose that the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs be given the mandate to manage this huge influx of mainly indigenous Amerindian people, albeit from Venezuela. And they should be given the funds, they should be given the equipment, they should be given the staff, and they should be given a master plan so that we do not go from day to day, week to week, month to month, just depending on international help or without coordinating the agencies in Guyana, which should be managing this migration problem. We also need to call attention to the role that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to play. This is not a local problem, it's an international problem. And other countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, which have been affected by this 6 million person migration out of Venezuela, have been able to collaborate. And Guyana must join that international movement to collaborate with other countries which have been affected by Venezuelan migration. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs must step forward and establish protocols for the collaboration with international organizations to help us to solve this problem. The Ministry of Home Affairs also, there is a security problem. The borders are not secure because people are pouring across the borders, and in some cases, you can walk across the borders. And these boat people use boats. They just come sailing down the river. And there are crimes. Some of them are committing crimes. And I am afraid that some of them will have crimes committed against them. And the Region 1, as you know, under my administration, the police so-called F division was broken up. So Region 1 now has its own police division, its own police commander. And he too must be given the resources and the personnel to ensure that law enforcement measures in that region are strengthened, and that he has the staff, he has the vehicles, he has the boats, he has drones, in order to fulfill his responsibilities. And of course, the Ministry of Legal Affairs. Now, there is a legal framework. Guyana cannot escape. We cannot turn both people, as you see happening in some other countries. We cannot escape responsibility or legal responsibility. And the Ministry of Legal Affairs now has to craft protocols, it now has to craft measures, it now has to improve our acts and our legislation to protect the migrants and also to protect the Guyanese who have been affected by this huge flow of migrants into our country. We have to look at education. We have to look at legislation. We have to look at registration of these Amerindian migrants. We have to look at sanitation. When you see people living and scrounging in the garbage dumps, we want to lift them above that level. Maybe some of them will remain in Guyana forever, but these are measures that we need to think about as we examine the Venezuelan migrant problem. It's not going to go away. These Venezuelan migrants who are coming in here are running from hell, and they are going to stay here for a very long time. This is not temporary. We better prepare for the long haul. They're not going anywhere. What are we going to do about the Warao? We are going to ask our government to bring these four ministries, the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Legal Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs together. We're going to ask them to craft a master plan so that they could work in a predictable manner to provide funds from our budget to ensure that these people are safely settled and they don't create social problems for the Guyanese who are resident here. What is taking place will affect our country for generations to come. Your children are going to be faced with the problem. If we do not solve the problem now, your children are going to be faced with the problem of what to do with these thousands of Venezuelan migrants who come into the country. And it is my view that it is better now to ensure that migration is regulated than to leave it unregulated. And right now, what is taking place indicates that migration is in a free fall. It's not being regulated. And the government must step in, particularly those four ministers must speak out about what they're doing to deal with the problem of managing Venezuelan migration. The Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Legal Affairs. And all four of them mean silent. Time to end the silence. Time to solve the problem of Venezuelan migration in Guyana, to save the next generation from having to face the consequences of the migration that is taking place at present. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must